Welcome to today's Tuesday talk. I'm very happy that today our fellow Gabriel Dorthe will present on the topic Trust in Science, or Science is Trust. Gabriel's background is in philosophy and environmental humanities. Prior to his time at the IASS, he has been working for the Little Catholic University in Switzerland at the Ethics Laboratory, particularly at the chair of Ethics, Technology and Transhumanism. Currently, he is working on a project funded by the Swiss National Foundation on Shadows of Geoengineering, the co-production of competing regimes of expertise in climate governance. As part of his project, he shares his time between the IASS and the Science and Technology Studies program of Harvard University in the United States. Just as a quick reminder, as usual, we will record this session. And now, please, Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Achim. Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here. So today, in this presentation, I will try to explore the meanings and implications of recurring calls to restore trust in science when confronted to what is called conspiracy theories, as long as these theories touch upon scientific and technological issues. So I'm well aware that there are many other things going on in these conspiracy theories, but one of the strong components remains related to science and technology, I found. For example, related to solar geoengineering, to vaccines, or to 5G. So at first sight, these conspiracy theories indeed appear as sites of a very strong distrust in science and technology, or in official science at least. But the term conspiracy theories might be inappropriate for my purpose, and because I'm not primarily interested in the production of conspiracy theories, stating, to take just one example, that the world elites are spraying chemicals in the atmosphere to control the population or to manipulate the climate. I am more interested in the uneven reception of these theories. And in this perspective, I will rather, at least tentatively, speak about unsanctioned suspicion. So what follows is based on exploratory ethnography, and it's all very exploratory, or rather programmatic. So I hope that you will find here some interest and that it can foster collaborations with those of you who work on related topics, such as climate policy or climate activism, for example. As the world worries increasingly about fake news, conspiracy theories, and distrust towards science, and as vaccination, masks, and other measures against the COVID-19 pandemic are more and more contested, many actors call for restoring trust in science. On January 16, in his opening speech of the announcement event of the key members of his science team, then President-elect Joe Biden ended the list of the 5 key areas on which he had asked them to focus by asking, how can we ensure the long-term health and trust in science and technology in our nation? In the early days of the current and, yes, never-ending pandemic, even before the WHO decided to characterize COVID-19 as a pandemic, its director raised a resounding alarm at the 56th Munich Security Conference. I quote, "We are not just fighting an epidemic, we are fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus, and it's just as dangerous." And he concluded with a strong call for the protection of the authority of legitimate sources of information that are expected to lead public policy. And I quote again, "If we don't, we are headed down a dark path that leads nowhere but division and disharmony." In an explicit parallel with the virus, the contamination can be voluntary or involuntary. Information or misinformation is thus naturalized as something that spreads on its own, just as a virus, with serious consequences on at-risk groups, and calls for strict measures, such as barrier gestures. The warning, the Tedros warning, was echoed by many political leaders, such as the French President Macron in his address to the French people on TV on November 24. "We will have to rely on knowledge and science, never give way to conspirationism, to obscurantism, to relativism." This is a slide for you, Achim, and for you, Mark. This calls for trust, and I would say for discipline, draw attention on what is left in the shadows, at least to my knowledge, in most of the literature on conspiracy theories. For these accounts lamenting about eroded trust in science, the problem is not just about the production of conspiracy theories, most of the time handled by a small number of people. The problem is more profound and I think more interesting. It relates to the unruly circulation of these theories to the larger number of people who get to receive these accounts and ideas about the world and think, yeah, maybe there's something interesting in there, and perhaps start seeing the world through these lenses, but just perhaps. In the motto, restore trust in science, the last component has to be nuanced, of course. Is it really science that is at stake, or is it expertise as embedded in public debates and public policies? But today, I will focus on the other part, on trust. And I will focus on how and by whom this trust has a problem or a deficiency of trust that should thus be restored. How is it defined in the context of infodemic or conspiracy theories? So a good segue to this might be to look at what is trust opposed to. And I will briefly examine the construction of three boundaries. First, trust is opposed to a loss of control. The word infodemic has been placed at the center of public attention as a matter of public health, not without good reasons, of course, but it is far from an innocent analogy. It carries a sense of contagion by dangerous viral information, a sense of sanitary risks, but also the need to trace contagion networks. And conspiracy theories or fake news are meant to be thwarted by barrier gestures, as suggested by Dr. Tedros. In the same line of thought, they are framed as sectarian deviances, for which a better education or care of the family or the close social environment can help very much. Here, citizens are seen and presented as being passively exposed to misinformation. They are seen as lacking the proper immune system to filter the true from the false. A second boundary that can be found in the literature opposes trust infused by reliable information on the one hand, and on the other hand, malevolent disinformation or lies. Building on cognitive sciences, this approach worries that the latter are more attractive than the first. Here, the focus is less on the mode of propagation than on the source. Several commentators, such as the very prominent or famous or infamous French sociologist Gérald Bronner, call for the regulation of what they see as a dramatically deregulated information market. Among the tools promoted in this perspective are better control of major social media platforms, of course, and more broadly of science communication. This position assumes that there are well and badly shaped products on the information market, and citizens are framed as consumers who, because of their cognitive bias, because the brain are made as they were in the early stages of humanity, they are not able to pick what's good for them. So they have to be helped for that, and some kind of authority has to intervene. So it's a very neoliberal vision, but still as a good neoliberal vision. When these people panic, they ask for a strong regulation. A third common boundary is drawn between trust and belief. First, there is an assumption that people, a very vague category, of course, mechanically believe what they see in the news, true or false. This goes back to the strong media effects theory in sociology that consider audiences as passive and homogeneous, a paradigm that is almost no longer in use, as many empirical studies have shown that the audience of the public can take many different forms. Another assumption is that there is a strong and quite obvious opposition, sorry for that, a strong and quite obvious opposition between trustworthy information produced and managed by reliable and legitimate institutions on the one hand, and on the other hand, shaky beliefs disconnected from reality. Hopefully it's the last one. This recent testimony of Anthony Fauci, the director of the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, about the flood of preprint studies, found it quite spicy. I quote, 11 o'clock in the evening, 12 o'clock comes and you have 25 of these things to read. You can't ignore them, but sometimes it gets a little confusing what you can really believe. So where is trust and what counts as misplaced belief in this situation? More so, framing the reception of conspiracy theories in terms of probably irrational beliefs flattens the variety of possible encounters with these theories. Is it passive attention, moderate skepticism, strong adherence, or is it activism? Belief, as anthropologists have shown, is something very complex, fragile, and never homogeneously distributed within social groups. So as I said in my introduction, I am more interested in what I call unsanctioned suspicion. By this, at least, I aim to underline that there is no clear line that can be easily drawn between rationalists and irrational conspiracy theorists. Or maybe better, that this line has to be complicated. There is a vast, uncharted territory where people are not necessarily convinced by hardcore conspiracy theories, but cultivate some kind of skepticism towards science, technology, and many institutions. This skepticism is, in turn, frequently discarded as conspirationism, plain and simple. To explore this territory might teach us some key elements regarding what counts as trust in science and for whom. In this section, I will make the hypothesis that conspiracy theories, when they touch upon sociotechnical controversies such as solar geoengineering or vaccines, can be considered as a form of public engagement towards technoscientific promises. Sociology of technoscientific promises has proved to be a productive framing for the study of overemphasized announcements from scientists or engineers and their impacts on governance of science and technology at large. Promises, in this sense, are performative acts of speech and are used as tools by scientists and engineers, as tools in the service of sophisticated strategies to secure competitive fundings and to gain public support. But this line of thought has mostly focused on the producers of promises, much more than on their intended or supposed receivers. In one of the founding papers of this field, Borup and his colleagues write, I quote, expectations have the appearance of greater authority for those who see themselves as having little influence over the outcome of a promise, publics, for example. This easily translates into a normative framing of expectations. It's going to happen, so you might as well get used to it. But the second quote draws attention to the effects of this allegedly disempowered reception of promises. Elevated levels of expectation and confidence also have the effect of inflaming concerns about risk in different communities based on differing values, knowledges, or institutional and organizational forms. Now, do people involved in some degree of belief and spread of conspiracy theories distrust science, or do they trust it too much? Is it really that surprising that some people protest on the streets or post countless videos on YouTube demanding an immediate stop to stratospheric chemical spraying under the portmanteau chemtrails, standing for chemical trails as opposed to regular condensation trails produced by aircraft engines? These activists think that solar geoengineering is already secretly deployed, with serious consequences for the health of humans, of animals, of vegetation. Since the early 2000s, some scientists and engineers keep presenting solar geoengineering or solar climate engineering as a potential efficient measure to increase the planet's reflectivity and thus counteract global warming. Several methods of climate engineering are being considered, but the most prominent is a plan to mimic a major volcanic eruption by injecting reflective particles into the stratosphere. Involved scientists are adamantly saying that this technology seems both mature enough and cheap enough for small or large-scale outdoor experiments, with, of course, many unknowns about the ethics or the governance of this thing. But technically, it seems feasible. Sorry. Another example, for decades now, that nanotechnology has been promoted as a major new field for research and innovation, a new frontier in science and technology. Promises have been flooding, some of them having proved to be realistic, mostly nanomaterials with their toxic downsides, but most of them remain ludicrous fantasies. This is probably the most famous. Injectable nanobots are expected to help cure any disease, deliver drugs with perfect precision, or even make humans immortal. This conceptual computer artwork won the first prize in the Science Concepts section of the 2002 UK Visions of Science Awards. It has become iconic and is, up until today, frequently showed in illustration of the fabulous promises of nanotechnology. Needless to say, these hopes for revolutionary medical cures, infused by mostly speculative technology, are still far from being achievable. But with this background in mind, it appears difficult to discard concerns about vaccines against COVID-19 being secretly filled with nanobots for nefarious aims, because these concerns at least partly originate in official reports and prestigious universities' press releases. These observations lead me to suggest that rather than a lack of trust in science and technology, unsanctioned suspicion ingrained in conspiracy theories related to science and technology show more of an inflated trust in technoscientific promises. If this hypothesis makes sense, it leads to further sparsely explored questions, and I will sketch some of them in the last section of my presentation. Science and technology studies look at and call for taking care of the various ways in which science, technology, and democracy are entangled in our societies. At the end of the day, trust in science, if any, refers to how facts and values are getting co-produced. In pages about ufologists that I think fit my argument on conspiracy theories, the French philosopher Émile H. writes, I quote, "It makes a moral difference to address them as explorers of democracy or as obscurantists. It is more interesting to live with curious people than with idiots. The more they are insulated, the less they get a chance to constitute their problems as legitimate concerns, which leads to sectarian deviances or caricatures." So in unsanctioned suspicion narratives, facts may well be, at first glance at least, frantically accumulated in a rather disorganized manner, but they are tied with strong values and sets of concerns. And I will end my presentation by sketching three of these concerns. Whether about solar geoengineering, about 5G, or to some degree COVID-related restrictions, a strong core of claims and statements refer to a feeling of being, as citizens, disempowered by states, or more so by many multinational companies. Think of Big Pharma, Bill Gates, or Amazon. This convenes a nuanced approach of trust. Who is the target of distrust in these narratives? Well, very specific social actors, actually, who have accumulated huge amounts of wealth and power. And Philip Morris and the Monsanto trials have shown that some of these big companies, at least, have not refrained themselves from circulating false expertise in order to downplay the toxicity of their products. Why not this time can sound as a reasonable question to ask. And actually, there was a book published in France a couple of months ago, a vast inquiry by journalists, science journalists, showing that some of these militant rationalists in France including Gerald Bronner that you've seen before, are also tied with some lobbies trying to at least downplay the risks of pesticides, glyphosate, things like that, and combat the precaution principle. End of the so some people I've interviewed so far, I mean, all of them, even if it's still a small sample, they always say that they feel some kind of optimism about the human nature at large. They genuinely think that if people get the right information, organize and speak up, the peril could be tamed and people could take back power on their own lives. And this leads to another central claim of these narratives, which is the capacity and necessity to think by themselves. An activist told me recently that she was perfectly able to draw connections between topics. She's driven by an undeniable curiosity, and she nourishes her need to understand the world with sanctioned as well as with unsanctioned media, and she never feels by no means manipulated. I took these two pictures in my neighborhood in Berlin. The one on the right claims that thinking is more mandatory than wearing a face mask. And the one on the left tags the German Querdenker movement with being a life threat. Activists on both sides accuse their opponents of being manipulated while claiming to be perfectly able to think by themselves. Many chemtrails activists present their engagement as originating in a disquiet observation of the sky, of their sky, above their homes, while the World Meteorological Organization has found a name for these anthropogenic clouds in 2017, homogenitus. Pictures of skies crisscrossed by aircraft trails are indeed the most widely used category of proofs showcased by chemtrail activists. Lasting longer and strangely shaped, those chemtrails should be readily noticeable by everybody looking up, really looking up to the sky. For some, once properly trained, one can see the nanoparticles used in the chemicals sprayed by airliners because of the way they react with sunlight, for example. And this is, by the way, something that is sometimes foreseen in the scientific literature, including in the founding paper by Paul Crutzen in 2002. The recurrent reference to the naked eye is an important feature of unsanctioned skepticism narratives and an interesting way to bind the visible and the invisible. Here you can see a sample of, it took me hours to compile this, but a sample of objects, of stickers, of face masks or buttons that you can buy online to help spread the word. In the same vein, some anti-5G activists buy electromagnetic radiation testers in order to measure and document the invisible threat to their health posed by a mast being built nearby their house, for example. The third and the last central set of claims of unsanctioned suspicion towards geoengineering, vaccines, or 5G that I wanted to highlight today refers to a feeling of being directly threatened by environmental pollution, poor air quality, or pervasive toxic materials. In this spirit, many activists willingly present themselves as being parents, which sort of strengthen their legitimacy to act. The body is seen as the front line between nefarious powers and citizens, or nefarious powers and individual freedom or liberty. In parallel, unsanctioned suspicion narratives often promote alternative ways to preserve body and mental health, such as detox, meditation, organic food. They are meant to be efficient in counteracting the poisoning and the contaminations that penetrate every aspect of our contemporary lives, in food, in clothing, or in cosmetics. This aspect would benefit, of course, from being reinscribed in the long history of individual hygiene and the power of governments. There, the balance of responsibility between individual behaviors for example, barrier gestures or masks, and public policies is far from being a given and is constantly renegotiated. Letting the individuals bear most of the weight of the situation narrows the perspective and sends politics back to the shadows. At the same time, it opens up ways for new or old-fashioned entanglements between discrete and social bodies. Speaking of history, it has always surprises in store. And as it happens, there were, I just discovered that a couple of days ago, there were an anti-mask league in San Francisco back in 1918 during the Spanish flu epidemic. This at least pleads for some prudence in correlating social media with unsanctioned suspicion narratives. So the matter of trust deserves closer scrutiny. What counts as trustworthy? For whom? At which cost? Where is trust negotiated and potentially stabilized? What do these pressing issues tell about the shifting relationships between the local and the global, my body and the planet, my freedom and the common good, or about the distribution of power? And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and insights.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Sorry. If you would like to ask a question or comment, please either raise your hand or put a writing question or so into the chat. And I must admit, Mark was the first one actually who wrote into the chat to me that he would like to raise a question because he also have to leave very soon. So I will just say, Mark, please start us off.
Thank you, Rafi, and thank you, Gabriel, for that very nice insight into your further developments. I've appreciated watching how this developed over time and how the depth of your thinking around conspiracy theory has gone from just the basic ideas. Are you able to hear me well? Sounds like everybody's.
You are sounding extremely garbled, Mark, like something like you're speaking into the, als wenn du jetzt in irgendein Blech hineinsprechen würdest, klingt es ein bisschen.
Then we'll just try it slowly. And one question. Thanks, Gabriel, for that great insight into how your work has developed. I have one question, which is in my talks on climate geoengineering, I tend to ask a series of questions. And one of those is reminiscent of what you said about techno-scientific promises. I ask, maybe or should we, or what happens if we expect climate geoengineering as an unavoidable future? And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, especially what happens when you start seeing things as an unavoidable future?
Yeah, I'm really sorry, but sound is, I think I missed the last part of the question. So
what happens if we see climate geoengineering and other technical developments as an unavoidable future?
I'm sorry, but I don't I don't hear. I mean, the sound is. I don't know if someone can maybe have a better reception. I'm sorry, Mark. I think we have to. We'll definitely talk more about that, but for now, I don't.
Kat has thankfully put it into the chat. Mark asks, what happens when you start seeing climate engineering as an unavoidable future?
Yeah, so this is, yeah, thank you very much. No, it's again, in the perspective of sociology of expectations or promises, it's the main issue, I think. It's that these promises kind of trap or capture the future and make some scenarios, some possibilities unavoidable or inevitable at the expense of others. It's structures and it frames the debate in terms of what is possible and what is not, even if some promises are still like 20 years later or 30 years later still impossible, such as nanobots, autonomous nanobots injected in the body, or you know, sequencing the brain. the human brain, the European Human Brain Project, which is a huge waste of money, at least if you look at the original promises they made. So yeah, it's I think there's a very much of a political need to question this to analyze these promises, these dynamics. Thanks, Kat, for your translation again.
Thank you very much. I had Stefan and Armin. Is anyone else would like to come in? Barbara as well. So then, and oh, I see in Flavio and Ilan. Okay, then Stefan, Armin, Barbara, Flavio, Ilan. Stefan, please.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Gabriel. It's fantastic talk, fascinating stuff. I was wondering what, I guess I have two, I should separate this out as two questions. The first is, it seemed like you were describing a situation in which there's an overconfidence in technoscience on the side of the recipient, and at the same time an overpromising on the side of, you know, whoever circulates these visions. So on the side of corporations, scientists, possibly governments. And I was wondering if is that kind of how you see these two, like the recipient side and the side that does the circulation? Is that how you would characterize those two sides, and what's the connection between those two things, the overconfidence on the one side and the overpromising on the other side? And then kind of linking to my second question, to me, always, you know, when you give these talks, it feels like we learn more about our own society, like the majority society, if you like, by looking at these fringe groups than necessarily about the fringe groups, where we learn also about the majority society. I'm making up these terms as I go. I'm sure you have better terms. So that's, I guess my question is, do you agree? And then is, you know, must that not be very different than for different societies? So is there a national cultural aspect to that as well, where we would have to say, you know, the extraordinarily polarized American society surely, you know, is different from the still, I would say, you know, largely consensual, also fraying, but still largely consensual and much more homogenous German society.
Yeah, thank you. It's very stimulating questions. For the first, I think for the sake of time and for the sake of the argument, I had to maybe to forget some nuances, but of course there are what some a French philosopher called dark or black and pink promises. So there are some, I mean, promises of a risk, for example, or of a danger or moral hazard. Let's think of, you know, artificial intelligence, super intelligent robots are always framed as mostly as dangers or existential threats for humanity, but they can still be analyzed in terms of promises. So I think this approach needs to be refined, of course, but also I certainly not forget that for many supposedly promoters of solar geoengineering, there are many doubts and hesitation. But still, yeah, I think it connects to Mark's question before. It still frames the future in terms of what has to be analyzed, where the credit, where the money has to go to fund which research and which not, etc. And for your second question, I still don't know. I mean, there are obviously these unsanctioned skepticism narratives. They travel quite well, at least in the Western world. I've been looking at what I've seen in the in my online ethnography and also in my interviews, is that people in France, in the UK, in the US, in Germany, in Switzerland, and I don't up until now I don't see any important difference. Even if sometimes, if you look at Switzerland, for example, it's definitely not the same political landscape than in France, where citizens have much more power to, for example, to object. I don't know, a construction of 5G or mast in their neighborhood. So as if there were, I think there has to be some kind of national specificities, but it's hard to say where and how it connects to the political and institutional landscape. And another problem is that these narratives are traveling very fast, and so the landscape has been very shaky the last few weeks, since January the 6th and what happened in Washington, D.C. So it's really difficult to follow, and they tend to sometimes to merge. So there's something about, I don't know, what happens in the US that connects to what happens in my backyard with a 5G mast. So it's I'm still having a hard time to figure out what to do with this problem. I'm done. If you.
Thanks. And then I had on my list as next Armin, please. Armin, could you please unmute you? Then we can hear you better.
Sorry. Okay. Thanks. Let's see how far I get. My machine keeps crashing when I use GoTo. So now, trust in science. Now I'm an economist, and I can contribute to examples of the trustworthiness of science, or in this kind, social science, economics. Mainstream economists told over decades to people that something like the Great Depression is no longer in the cards. It's impossible. The financial system is stable. And then, of course, it crashed in 2008. Well, okay, so what's the reason behind that? Well, in 2013, the Bank of England published a bulletin in which it declared that most economic textbooks are simply wrong. Why? Because the way how they explain how money is created is counterfactual nonsense. Well, the Bank of England was a bit more polite, but this was the message. Well, if you can't trust scientific textbooks, well, then it's not a perfect background for actually fostering trust. Now, how do you explain that? Well, I basically see two basic mechanisms that are candidates for explaining it. Either it's conspiracy. Okay, fine. You don't like conspiracy? Well, then it's just incapability. It's just bad craftsmanship. It's just rotten science. So now think twice. What do you like more, conspiracy or rotten science? Thanks.
Thanks for this. I don't know if I have something to add. It's perfect. But you raised another aspect that I have not yet approached. There's a matter of prediction. The economics they make predictions. So I have to think about it. It's stimulating, at least. Thank you.
Rotten science is a conspiracy.
Well, let's say at least it was a very quick answer. So I had Barbara next on my list.
Well, we don't hear you, Barbara.
Barbara, you have to unmute yourself.
Hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Good. Lovely talk. Thank you. Lots to think about. I like to think about the triangle of science, trust, and promises, and why we are surprised that people don't trust science in that combination. Because if you look, what people expect of science is to tell them about what they found, the facts, how they see the interrelation of issues that are already there. The promises engage with the future. And anybody who engages with the promises that have happened from nuclear power to genotechnology to nanotechnology to whatever, know that the promises are in the realm of no longer that what already exists, but what is wished for. And in that realm, of course, science is virtually no different from other people. And it is when they leave the basis upon which they normally are trusted for their skills and knowledge, that the lack of trust is perfectly reasonable, or the lack of trust as skepticism certainly is reasonable, because they become very little different from where everybody else is as well, when they say, oh, I'm sure I will do this, and I know if you give me money, then I can produce this. It's no longer any different. All right, you can do more on the basis of what you already know and you project it forward, but it's still a projection forward that has this huge dose of wishful thinking. And I think as soon as science moves into that domain, to my mind, the reduction in trust is to be expected.
Yeah, thank you. No, there's definitely more to dig in. Also in your work, Barbara, to elaborate more on this aspect of my work. Yeah. I don't know if it was a question. I take it more as a compliment or.
It wasn't a question. It was a reflection on that triangle of science, trust, and promises.
Yeah.
How the temporal aspect and the future features in it. And we take the future so for granted in terms of, or assume it's the same as issues about the present. Well, in science, it's not the same. If you talk about present facts, it's something very different to talking about projections and promises and what was the other one? Promises, expectations, etc. Yeah. And predictions. So you're entering a futures domain that is very different from knowing past and present, which is the strength base of science. That the whole futures domain has to be taken with a lot more skepticism and caution, because the specialist position of science can't be maintained in that futures domain as well as it can in present and looking to the past. That was my observation. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks. I would have next on my list Flavio, Ilan, and now Pia, but Kat also sent me a chat message that she would love to make a quick question, actually, because she has to leave a bit early. I hope it's okay for you, Flavio, Ilan, Pia, if Kat jumps the time. Great. Then Kat, please.
Thank you for letting me jump the queue as well. Thanks ever so much for your super interesting talk, Gabriel. What I was thinking of while you were talking was that there seemed to be like a number of points at which these kind of practices that relate to conspiracy theories intersect with practices from the bottom-up knowledge-making communities. So things like the sensing of the 5G electromagnetic waves and kind of this the bedrock of conspiracy theories, which is thinking that there are hidden power structures, which actually are also extant in some cases and are researched by people like Transparency International and the Influence Mapping Network. So in some ways there's a complementarity to the practice, but they're kind of diametrically at odds with each other as well, and could counteract each other. And I was wondering if you've delved into that at all, or if you had any plans to think about that and what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, thank you very much for this, because it gives me the opportunity to say that not all the anti-5G activists are to be considered as conspiracy theorists. Far from that, but so this is exactly why I've started a new fieldwork unexpectedly in May, when I started to work on this project, and I found out all these things about the 5G related to the virus, and all about something invisible, something in the air. I think that there's also something, but it is another question. So I started to interview some of the 5G anti-5G activists in Switzerland and in France. Under this was my first question: that how do you position yourselves towards these conspiracy theories? Does it impede your work, your action, or not? How do you what is it? Does it permit? Do you have some of these people in your own association or collectives? And it seems to be a kind of clear line in some of these groups, in others not. For example, someone I interviewed in Corsica in France, she is into different things, like into chemtrails and into anti-5G with institutional actions, with petitions and talking with the mayor and everything. So it's not clear who is in and who is out, which is I find really interesting. And in other situations, I mean, it's a boundary walk, right? So it's the whole boundary is a matter of competition for people involved. So there was this. I think I talked about that in my previous talk, so I didn't want to take it back, but it was very tempting for me today. Chemtrails activists asked Greenpeace International to make a statement about geoengineering, so they had to respond in a press release saying, "Well, we don't have any enough facts, proofs to say something meaningful, so just come back when you have something." So there are this also with anti-GMO activists who still struggle very much to make the case that their claims are based on reliable scientific expertise. And the chemtrails think, "Oh, we are in the same camp. We can work together." And no, please back off. We don't need that on top of all our problems. So it's a whole, I think, fascinating. But I don't have something meaningful to say in terms of interpretation. But in terms of observation, there's lots to say. and to share and to discuss with others. Maybe if you have also you and others have observed or seen some things that can be interesting in this perspective.
I mean, I know more about the citizen science and influence mapping stuff than but I would be delighted to talk further about how those practices mirror or reflect each other.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Okay. Thanks. We still have Flavio, Ilan, and Pia on the speakers list, which I would also then close because we are approaching 3 p.m. Except, of course, the questions and the responses would be very brief, which I would anyway kindly ask you to. But let's come over. Flavio, please, your turn.
Thank you, Achim. Thank you, Gabriel. It was a very interesting presentation, lots to think about. So I'm going to try to make the question as quick as possible. I don't know in your research how much you have looked into this connection between individuals and subgroups to the far left and the far right within conspiracy theory movements, and how much of a danger or of a hope might that be when it comes to openness to dialogue? Because I know this sounds way too out there, but given this whole idea of, quote, establishment truth holders being acting self-righteous and being snobbish, do you see this as one of the reasons for those groups to get together at times? And what do you make of this unusual fact of them sometimes partnering up? And yeah, that's a general question, of course. I don't know if you have looked into that, but thank you again for the presentation. I learned a lot from it.
Thank you. I remember we had a similar conversation in June with because I think the backdrop of your question is Brazil and what happens here. Or, for example, we talked about that after my first talk. I don't know. I'm not very. It's not easy for me to find a standpoint, and but obviously there are some very nasty people in there. But there's also a mix of far right and hippies and leftists and liberals. So it's really hard to say. So I don't want to downsize, say that, oh no, there are no Nazis in this conspiracy theory. They are, but it's not just about that. There is something in there that I want to explore and to study, and it's what I do. I look at epistemology and how epistemology is connected to values and to distribution of power. But I think it connects to the quote I read from Émilie Ash, this French philosopher. Like, the more you push them back as you're not part of the democratic deliberation process because you don't respect the rules, because you're from the far right, the more you encourage them to just get radicalized somehow. So there's but here it goes back to Stefan's question about national context. I think in some countries, in some contexts, I think we can still have this dialogue, and in others it might be more difficult, for sure.
Thanks. Ilan, please.
Thank you, Gabriel. Very interesting talk and a lot of interesting ideas to think further on. There are maybe two aspects that I just want to touch on for further discussion at some point, and maybe takes more than a moment. But the two aspects are that I'm very interested in the issue of trust, kind of unpacked as part of an examination of the fears and sense of disenfranchisement, inequity, lack of agency that underlies that lack of trust. Or if one puts it the other way around, which I've seen in some political contexts, of a false sense of agency, of having control, that if we do this, we will prevail, and therefore the conspiracy or the false narrative, whatever you want, becomes very compelling. And it becomes compelling as an emotional response, not because of the content in particular. The second piece here is that I'm concerned about what you, I think, very rightly and I think very importantly point out, in a sense, is the hyping of black box technology and complexity of science, the promises of that, which is ironically, I think, buttressed by the fact that science is taught as an assembly of facts. And that becomes a real problem when you talk about non-facts and everything is opinion. But I think some of that stems from the fact that, that we teach science not as a way of thinking about the world, but as, here's the information and we chunk it in little pieces and silos, and then we're done. Well, how the hell are you supposed to make sense out of that if somebody tells you, well, all of this is non-fact? So I think these are the pieces I'd like to, think further about, and would love to do it with your help and thoughts.
With pleasure and great interest. Yeah, sure. I totally agree on the science teaching point. It's there's a very famous word by Latour, like let's talk about, and also Thomas Kuhn in a way. Let's start talking about science in a realistic way, and if we don't get surprised if science is involved in many weird rhetoric moves. I mean, it will not save the world, but maybe we could start there, or start again at this point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then now the final question, comment, intervention is for Pia. Pia, please.
Ray, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. So I'm wondering about science communication, and also, I mean, you've mentioned the corona pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic several times. So in circumstances of crisis communication, when people want to see some specific responses that are in people's best interest, no matter whether they believe sort of in the appropriateness or normativity of the underlying assumptions. You simply want people to protect themselves. So do you think there is sort of some way of opening some chance how this could be improved? Thanks.
I could briefly say that not presenting this, what's in your own interest as the only thing, but also give, maybe to connect to Ilan's question, also to keep the whole context. I remember when I was during the first lockdown, I was living in France, and there was this whole rhetoric about war against the virus, and the scientists have talked and have said we have to do that and that. And it's not a responsible way to, I think, to behave. And it was really striking to see the difference with Angela Merkel's positions. So just to probably assume that it's not the science coming from above and God's voice, but that it's embedded, and it's at some point some people in charge have to take decisions that can be harsh and can be difficult for many people, sure. but these decisions are still decisions, and they have, and to show how these decisions are made, what they are made of, I think it could help. I don't know if it responds to your question, but just be careful on how, take care of how science and technology, or how facts are embedded in these policies, because they are. Of course, and the expertise is extremely important in our times, but it's yeah. So, but we can go deeper with how expertise is constituted and in different contexts, but maybe we don't have. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we have time for that.
Thank you.
I'm turning to Achim, and I have Ingeborg wanted to ask me some questions in the chat.
Well, the thing is, yes, please, Scott.
No, I cannot read the one in German, but I can just about the interests of those who are spraying, or the interests of those who are putting nanobots in vaccine. It's also something that I'm looking closely now, because it goes back to the economic interest, and it's not clear. But again, there's one component, one aspect is that they take very seriously when some entrepreneurs say, "Oh, there's lots of money to do here with, I don't know, smart grids and or contactless payments," and so they will take it very at face value. So it has to be connected to. Sometimes it's for climate control, but sometimes it's for mind control, or but it moves very fast. So a couple of years ago, it was for mind control, and now it's connected to 5G. So it's other issues. It unfolds different how you connect the issues, the reasons, the rationale is very different. I don't know if it answers you.
No problem. You are staying with us for a couple of more months. Of course, you share your time actually with Harvard in this regard, but I think if there are any questions left, everyone could just contact you. And with that, I would like to conclude today's Tuesday talk. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your interesting presentation. And thank you all for the interesting discussion and all the points you've raised. Beyond that, I would say stay healthy, enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the week, and see you around at some point.